All right, so to save the best for last, we're going to now look at how I set things up in Z Shell. It's very similar to how I set things up inside of PowerShell in terms of getting the suggested commands from the OpenAI API. But it's slightly different because of how I go about showing status and how I go about starting up a subshell to actually reach out to the API instead of just blocking the main process. Instead, I start up a subshell that retrieves the response, and then it brings that back to the main shell process to display inside of the prompt. Okay, so over in Z Shell, if I type a question, list big files, so I provide that as if it were a command, and then Control B, that asks OpenAI, and then eventually the question is replaced by a possible command. If I had some sort of failure, that would show instead, but in this case, we get back a command. So this is all made possible via what's known as a widget. And so a widget you can think of as a plugin to the line editor where you're typing text into the Z Shell interface. And that plugin then can extend functionality. For example, in my case, if I list out bindKey-L, if I grep for ask, you can see I get back a line here that indicates that Control B is bound to ask OpenAI widget. That is the widget that I defined. And if I hop over to the code, I've got the definition of that widget here. If you'd like to look at this code, you can hop out to my .files repository out on GitHub. It'll have the latest version of the code, which might be slightly different. I know I did make some changes when I opened this up. For example, I renamed the entryPoint.py script, which I'll mention in a moment. I renamed that to single. Now, there might be a lot here in terms of code and comments, but don't let that overwhelm you. It's actually a pretty simple function. Essentially, we start out here by adding the asking OpenAI. That shows up down below the prompt in what's known as the post display. Basically, this is a chunk of text that you can have display after the prompt and after the user input. And this is specific to Z Shell. So just to make sure, if I do help, watch down below in the lower left, there's asking OpenAI. And there's done, and then I've got man and Z Shell. All right, so let's come back to our widget here. The next variable here just captures the question that was asked, keeps it available so it can be restored. That's not important. And then the most important part is right here, where I capture a response from OpenAI. And I do that by calling out basically to Python, and then to this entry point script. And so that sweeps under the rug, calling out to the API and getting a response back. I'm not going to get into the entryPoint.py in this video because I already explained this in my previous PowerShell video. Now, when I call that script, I'm passing some context to it. These two lines right here. And the first line here says, hey, this is Z Shell, so don't generate, for example, PowerShell commands. I'm also giving the environment in this case, which would be Darwin for macOS. That comes out of uname. And then, of course, whatever's in the buffer that the user has typed in, that'll be mapped as the question. So that is the input that gets passed to the entry point when it's run. And then whatever spits back out of the entry point, that's captured here into the response. I then grab the exit code, and I do some checks based on the exit code. Ignore most of that. At the end of the day, I'm essentially capturing the response as well as the status. Now, there are some other parts to this code that help this run in the background with a subshell. I'll actually explain that in a subsequent video because this one's getting rather long. For now, just forget the fact that I'm sending a signal here to the main shell. Instead, I'm going to scroll down to where this picks up. So once that response comes back, this function is called. And the very first thing we do here, I read out the status from this first file, and I set the post display status. That basically shows the word done down below the prompt. And then down below that, I read out the response from this other temporary file. And then assuming success, which would be done in terms of the status, I go ahead and take the response and I put it into the buffer. The buffer is where user input is held. And so if I overwrite the buffer, that means I'm going to replace whatever the user typed with a suggested command. And so whatever goes into that buffer variable inside of a widget, that's what ends up here then replacing whatever you typed in at the command line. For example, in this case, that buffer was replaced with man and Z Shell.